Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines and the stories that make our community tick. Well, our guest today is often behind the headlines, not in them. Colleen Murphy is responsible, though, as much as anyone in our state for decades now, in our ability to find out what public officials are doing in our name with our money. Colleen has just retired after 35 years at the Freedom of Information Council. She's the executive director since 2005, and it's a big moment, big change for our state, and a big moment for Colleen. Colleen, thanks so much for coming in the studio today, Dateline New Haven.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Now, you told me before you came on the air, so your final date as executive director is February 27. Doing the job since 2005 as the executive director, being in that agency for 35 years, you are, at least for a few months, I guess through the legislative session, going to go in a couple days a week.
That's right.
And is that to help your successor know where everything is?
Yes, to help with the transition.
What's that like when someone, it's hard for a lot of people when they step down from something. Like I had been the editor of The Independent since 2005, and then in 2022, while I have other jobs here, I stepped down, someone else came there. And it's kind of interesting to sit with someone younger doing a job you did for a long time that you care about. Like you got to stop yourself from trying to tell them to do everything exactly the way you did it, rather than try to figure out cool new ways to do things. Have you had any moments like that where your successor had some interesting way of doing something and it caught you by surprise?
I don't think that's happened yet, but I certainly anticipate that it will. Just in my few days of semi-retirement, I have felt the urge to jump in and answer questions and offer my opinions about things, and I'm just learning to step back just a little bit. I told the successor that she doesn't have to be me. She has to be her own person, but seeing that in operation will probably be a little tricky for me.
And it's also interesting how, because you have a set of relationships for people for decades, legislators, reporters, other members of the public who have wanted to deal with government. And then there are all sorts of people who will be interfacing with government new time, developing their own relationships with your successor. And that's an interesting transition too.
Right.
Because there's a small group in Connecticut who really care about freedom of information. We have a very good law. And in my opinion, as a reporter, a very good commission. Like so many reporters in the state, I've written requests for information more times than I can ever remember. I've had the chance to go up a bunch of times to hearings with you guys when I felt officials were holding stuff back. Got an incredibly fair hearing. And that's just like a wonderful thing to have. Is that your view too, finishing it? Do you think we have a good law? Do you think that we have open government in Connecticut?
Right. Absolutely. We have a good law. Every state has some form of Freedom of Information Act. Our law covers, unlike many states, it covers both public records and public meetings, which right there is a big deal.
What's the difference in other states?
Other states typically just cover the public records provisions, or they might have a separate statute that governs how meetings ought to be run. Ours is all combined in this one statute, and our law also applies to the everybody, from the governor all the way down to the dog warden in town. In some states...
Have you had a dog warden case?
I think we have.
Do you remember what it was?
No. I think there was one story recently, I'm not sure if that was the dog warden, where a very unfortunate situation where a woman was mauled to death by her neighbor's
Here in New
dog.
Haven.
Was that New Haven?
Yeah, it was a woman. I covered that. Jocelyn. She was a woman who grew up in Church Street South, and she was with a man who I think was an academic. I'm not sure. They're right up the street here on Whaley Avenue. And
okay.
And the dog just went crazy when she came home with him and mauled her to death. Yeah.
Right. I think there were actually maybe more than one story like that.
Oh.
Also, speaking of dogs.
And what was the FOI question there?
The FOI question was about the report prepared by the police department and I think maybe the local warden or whatever.
Who is a police officer, at least here.
Right.
Yeah.
And, getting access to that report. I think in one of those cases, one of the claims was the privacy rights of the dog.
Whoa.
Which is very interesting.
So do dogs have privacy rights?
So,
and what did you guys decide? Did the law even deal with that question?
So I think it got resolved without having to deal with that question, but it just shows you that new concepts of privacy come up all the time.
What do you think about
agency.
that? Do animals have privacy rights?
Well, perhaps their owners have vested privacy rights in them. I think they kind of live simultaneously with their owners, perhaps.
Well, at least the case here, I don't know if it's the same case you had. That's a condo complex. Would neighbors have a right to know if this is a rabid dog that's almost killed people before?
Right. I think that is clearly the public interest question in it. And, in terms of the privacy rights, at least typically with respect to people, privacy rights are distinguished upon death. So applying that analysis, the dog in that instance, once deceased, would not have those privacy rights if they existed at all.
So what an interesting job you have, Colleen. Why does it matter to have an open government law? Why does it matter that we have people like you working full time to make sure that the law gets carried out so we can find out what our government's doing?
Yeah, I think it's, sometimes people think this is overstated, but I certainly do not think it is, that it's a fundamental part of having a democracy. And, our country was founded on the principles of, having a more open government. The king kept all his secrets in England, and we wanted to get away from that. The king made all the decisions. We wanted to get away from that. And although there's nothing in our Constitution about it, I think it's, part of the First Amendment. And it's kind of, within the fabric of the Constitution itself. And I think in order for a democracy to run, the people have to know what their government is doing to make informed decisions about who ought to govern them. So it's really goes back to that fundamental tenet that it's clearly very integral to having a democracy.
And we're talking to Colleen Murphy, who has been integral to Connecticut's democracy. Worked 35 years at the Connecticut's Freedom of Information Commission. She's been the executive director since 2005, 20 years. And she's just retired. She's doing a transition out of the job as we speak. Colleen, I guess our law was written in 1975.
Yes.
And Watergate had just happened. And tell me if I'm wrong about this, that there was a wave around the country, federal level and state level, of lawmaking saying, what are we going to learn from Watergate? What do we need to do? We need laws to make sure that stuff isn't done as much in secret. Was Bill Curry the author of Connecticut's? Do you know who wrote?
No, El Grasso was
Well,
the
she's
governor.
the governor, yeah.
But I don't think that he
was
was
state
involved.
senator,
There
yeah.
was a number of legislators. Martin Burke comes to mind from, I believe he's from Manchester, and one of the leaders on the bill going forward. But it had been, rumbling around in the legislature for years, and I think Watergate just helped push it across the finish line, along with a very strong governor who had promised that if she were elected, we would have a comprehensive act.
Okay. And we, so at the same time, there were also campaign finance laws, and some of those ended up having the opposite effect of what was intended. I'm thinking of political action committees, PACs, and there come a new way for rich people or special interests to give more money and not necessarily always be transparent, like super PACs. Has that happened with FOI, or has it held up? What have you seen?
I think by and large, it's really held up. And of course, in Connecticut, they had the added benefit of creating this commission, for which I have had the honor of working for the past 36 years.
36 years. Okay.
Yes. And, that in itself has been very unique. There's only a couple of other states that have anything at all like it. And I think that's part of...
Well, how do they decide? Do people have to go to court in other states?
Right. You have to decide if you're going to challenge. Sometimes there are internal structures within agencies to appeal up a couple of levels, or you might have to go to a political constitutional officer, perhaps. Sometimes you have to go to the Secretary of the State or the Attorney General, which we believe cuts back on independence. So our law has held up because of... in part because of this independent commission that
And I was struck,
administers.
I've gone up, I think, 4 times to argue a case there. And I was struck by how fair and serious the commissioners were. They were fair to me and they were fair to the public officials. And it was such a such a great kind of atmosphere up there. We all cared a lot, but it was collegial and based on facts, and you kind of felt like you got your hearing.
Right. I'm glad to hear that. And
I went 2 for 4, and that's okay.
Yeah. Okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Baseball, that's a pretty good average. But I think that's what we really aim for. We aim for it to be a place where citizens, just regular people, I mean, people in the media, yes, but regular people can come and really ask their government questions about things that are important in their lives, from, what the school curriculum is to why the Home Depot went in down the street. So having an environment where people don't have to have a lawyer, where they can just come on their own, say, I asked for this information, I didn't get it, is this fair? Is this appropriate under the law? And we do try to make it a place that where everybody feels like they're getting that fair shake, and that they can do so with really no cost if they don't hire a lawyer, and just an investment of some time, of course.
And it to be more important was sort of like you could always call up the FOIC, Freedom of Information Commission. So the advice, especially Mitchell Perlman over the years, has always kind of guided you what you could get and couldn't get under the law. Never took a stand saying, like we're going to say they have to do something, but let you understand what the law is. And that's important. And then also when a case comes before the FOIC, then the local officials in town sometimes get used. Like the Independent's been a whole bunch of times we won where all these meetings were taking place in closed doors and votes taken. And once the FOIC said you can't do that, then those meetings did become public. So that was kind of interesting.
Right.
Where were you in 75 when this got passed? And where was your mind on these issues?
School.
You were in grade school. Okay.
Right. I remember hearing about President Nixon resigning while going to my birthday party. And, I had no idea what impact all of that would ultimately have on my life. But I also came across recently a report that I did on the tapes involved in Watergate and what happened in the political environment back then.
The guy who blew the whistle on Butterfield just died yesterday.
Right, I just saw that. Yeah. I just think it's pretty funny that that's what I chose to write.
How old were you when you did that?
And I'm going to say I was maybe 12, 13.
Wow, I had no idea about that stuff when I was 12. Yeah.
Somewhere along the way, I found that in cleaning out my parents' house. They had a bunch of my...
And what did you say in your report?
I said that... basically, I just said how important it is for people to know, especially what their president is doing on their behalf.
You weren't worried about secret taping.
Right.
Because that was another issue in the whole thing. And where were you? What community?
I grew up in Danbury, Connecticut.
Okay. So then you're a kid in Danbury, 12 years old, knowing about the secret White House taping system. So
Yes.
you were headed for law school, huh?
I had no idea at the time. I think I thought I was going to be an oceanographer back then, but I took a different path, clearly.
So where'd you go to law school?
I went to Boston College.
And then what led you to the FOIC?
But did not become a Red Sox fan while I was there.
Did you go straight to the FOIC after that?
I did.
And you were staff attorney?
I did. I was a staff attorney.
And why did you want to go there? Was it the same reason you wrote that paper at 12 years old?
When I got out of law school, I had worked during law school at some private law firms, and I really had those moments where I said, this is not for me. I knew I wanted to do government service of some kind. I also knew I wanted to come back and do that government service in Connecticut. And I was fortunate. I got a number of interviews from the Attorney General's office to the legislature to the Elections Enforcement Commission and then the FOI Commission. And honestly, the passion that Mitchell Perlman had when I met with him.
He was the executive director.
He was the executive director, kind of the father of FOI here in Connecticut. And
he's still active on a volunteer basis.
He definitely
I
is.
should mention, just for transparency, I recently joined, just a couple months ago, a private group that advocates for freedom of information in Connecticut, the Connecticut Council for Freedom of Information. And they do talk to Mitch and
Yes.
Colleen about issues. Yeah.
Yes. So
you like the
Mitch was
passion.
the
So did you
tipping
choose them or did they choose you? But could you have worked for the Elections Commission?
Yes, I chose them. I've told this joke recently that I had an offer from both, and I spoke to Mitch Perlman about it, and he told me that the elections agency would be a very boring place to work, even though the then executive director there, another person for whom I have a lot of respect, Jeff Garfield,
Oh, yeah.
was in charge and a great guy.
So you became a lawyer, young person, idealistic, believed in government service. You went there fine. What happened? Do you remember an early moment or an early case where you said either, this is why I'm doing it, or this is how it makes a difference, or boy, this is harder, this is more complicated than I thought?
Well, all of the above there. I think probably the most significant case that happened early in my tenure involved a request for a police report from a candidate then running for governor, John Rowland. And I heard that.
Oh, you're talking about that case about the domestic violence in the town outside Waterbury where the police chief was also a campaign fundraiser for the governor candidate, John Rowland. I think we're talking 1990.
Right around then, because that's when I started.
So he was a fundraiser, and he said that and he was protecting the release of a complaint of domestic violence against Rowland and his ex-wife. And the argument brought to the commission, if I remember correctly, was that because it's an open investigation, and actually this is one of the cases I lost that I thought I was right about. They could say for years and years that something's an open investigation, even if there's no evidence that they've worked on this investigation. And then they could say to the FOIC, you have an exemption that I don't have to release an open investigation because it could affect the outcome and limit our ability to find the perpetrator. Even on this case, the police chief was the friend of the alleged perpetrator, and there was no more investigation going on. Do I have that right?
Very, very close. The claim was actually uncorroborated allegations of criminal
and we're seeing that the Epstein
activity.
files now, which I'm actually sympathetic to Donald Trump about and others, is that, like, uncorroborated allegations in a report, anyone can say anything about anybody.
Right. And that is why there is an exemption for it.
So it's not about open cases, it's about uncorroborated allegations.
Right. Okay. It never got to the point of describing it as a domestic violence incident, but it left everybody wondering what this was. And, we always advocate, like, when in doubt, like, give it out, because... When in doubt, give it out. Tell me about that. So even if there is an exemption, that particular exemption in the law, exception to disclosure, is what we call a permissive one. Even if it applies, you don't have to rely on it, or even if you're not quite sure.
So it doesn't say you may not release a report with uncorroborated allegations. It says you have the option of ruling that it doesn't have to be released because of that. So how do you get guidance from that law? How do you decide it's not just I want to because I don't like John Rowland, or I do want to exempt it because I like John Rowland? How do you advise your commissioners how to interpret that permissive language?
Right. Well, for us, in the end, we don't make that determination. For us, if the claim has been proven that there are uncorroborated allegations, which our commission said the opposite.
What did your commission say?
Our commission said that exemption did not apply. And we can't disclose what was in the record, but we, after reviewing the record, said we didn't believe that particular exemption applied.
And was that because you felt it was corroborated? Or, the big thing here is if you're friends with the police chief, they could just decide not to investigate, and then it's not corroborated because they didn't try to corroborate it. So then for FOI came up short because it didn't let us know something about our next governor, right?
Right. I think that's the tricky thing with the uncorroborated. If you have two people involved in an incident and one says one thing and another says another, it's hard to find corroboration at all.
Right. So you look for evidence. If someone tells someone, is there any physical evidence, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. So, I'm bound because we lost the case in court, so I can't really say.
So if I remember correctly, you ruled release it, and the election was coming, and then Christine Vertifley, if I said her name right, who was a Superior Court judge, ruled that you couldn't release it. What was her reason?
That it was uncorroborated allegations of criminal activity, and pretty strong saying that. So,
and what happens if a chief doesn't want to have a case investigated and corroborated? Does that mean FOI is not going to protect this, or it going to mean we have to get the right judge who cares about public right to know?
That's a good question. I think, our arguments about how can you get corroboration with only two people involved kind of plays into that maybe there ought to be some more nuances to that particular exemption, because just the law is, if it is found to apply, then you just have to disclose.
And with so much with freedom of information, there are interesting arguments on both sides. And of course, did it matter to the commission that when Roland did eventually become governor, he didn't win that year. He named that judge. Was it to the state Supreme Court or the appellate court and Supreme Court? So he rewarded her for protecting him. Did that give any shudders in the FOIC?
Well, for those of us, inside, it certainly gives you pause. Yes, when that kind of thing happens. We're talking
Colleen Murphy, executive director of the Freedom of Information Commission, retiring after 36 years of the commission, including 20 years as executive director. That's a great case you come up. Any other cases come up in your mind that were important to you that said this is why I do it or this is why it's more complicated?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the most memorable ones come out of very difficult situations. And we had a case following the Sandy Hook massacre.
I had a feeling you were going to bring up Sandy Hook. Yeah, that was a rough one.
Yes, and it was about the request that we got, or that we had to ascertain whether it was subject to disclosure or not, was for the 911 calls from the school to the police. And, very emotional, very difficult for everybody involved in it. And the state's attorney got involved in that case and said, kind of relied on the exemption that you talked about earlier about open case, harmful to potential prosecution. But
they found the guy right away.
But
could they get more evidence of something? When they interview the guy, will the guy know that you now know from the recording that he said something about where the weapons were or something?
I think it was not even that thought out at that point. I mean, the perpetrator was deceased. The police had announced that there was no one else that they were going to prosecute, but this request came in for these 911 calls and the reliance on that exemption. So the commission had to look at the exemption applies if there is an open case, if release would be potentially harmful to that future potential prosecution. And we found without there being any prosecution in view, it was hard to establish that anything would be harmful, although, recognizing the very difficult content of those records. But I think our commission felt, when things like police response time, providing assurance one way or the other that the police response was appropriate or it wasn't, that release of those kinds of calls, as anguish-filled as they might be, would help the public get an understanding about that.
Yeah, and they have right to know how things dealt with. Now, were the police, in truth, was it the police who said we don't want to release it?
It was the police, but really guided by the state's attorney's office.
State's attorney?
Yes.
Wow. And was that because they really felt bad for the victims' families and they just wanted to find a way not to have the families to have to go through that?
I definitely think that's
and that's the tough thing about being in law enforcement or being an FOI commissioner or being a journalist is that sometimes you really feel bad for folks, but if you're dealing with law,
right,
it's a little tough.
Right. And following that, there were public hearings. There was a task force established to try to determine whether there ought to be more exemptions to law enforcement records. And fortunately, the law didn't change too much. I think what ultimately was put in place is a provision that exempts homicide photos, basically, of the victims.
Okay.
Because there was also a concern about that people would want access to that.
And I also think that, I always felt the commissioners and the commission did not try to be for or against police. I don't want her to do their job. But I felt like they sometimes had to take the police word. Do you feel they sometimes erred on the side of police just so that you don't cause something bad to happen? Like I had one case where it was clear the police were never going to release a report that might have implicated a chief in a murder. And years later, they wouldn't release a report. And on the stand at the FOIC, the police person was asked, when's the last time you made any call or looked in this case at all? And they couldn't remember for the last year, 5 years. They couldn't remember for 5 years having ever done anything on the case, but they claimed it was still open. And the FOIC felt they had to take their side in that. Sort of like but you didn't do that for the police chief in Roland's case. Right. Do you think it's hard to make that call? Do you think it makes sense to err on the side of the police?
It is hard to make that call, and we certainly recognize we're not law enforcement, and we all have the same interest in getting the bad guys. So I think there is some deference that's given if, something can be shown to the commission that would indicate that release, maybe early release, would somehow be harmful to catching the perpetrator.
And I wonder if that's partly an issue with FOI, as with a lot of other law enforcement, like landlord inspections. The people you really don't have to worry about are going to follow the law.
Right.
And you're not usually going to have to take them to FOI. The people who want to hide something because they did something wrong are the people you have to take to FOI, but then they're saying, trust us because we're cops.
Right.
But then you have to think, I don't want someone to get killed or not arrested, and then they go kill somebody else if I don't release the info.
Yes.
That's a tough information.
It's a tough balance. The police records are tricky. We have another case that's back with us from the Supreme Court about an unsolved murder in Madison. There was an HBO documentary on it, Murder at Middle Beach, which was the son of this woman who was murdered, I'm going to say, over a decade ago. And he did a documentary on it, but used the FOI process, used the clinic over at Yale to help him try to get access from the police department to their records.
About his mom.
What's that?
About his mom?
About his mom, yes.
Wow.
And he set out trying to understand her life a little bit and, hopeful that maybe he would uncover something, and wound up in quite the tangle with the police over it that has now bounced through our commission all the way up to the Supreme Court, back down to us, and has not been completely resolved
What did
yet.
you guys resolve? What did you guys rule?
Well, it's on that standard that we were talking about.
About what's an open case?
Like a cold case. Is it a cold case, or is it actually, lukewarm? Is it hot? What is it? So the commission found that when the law department came before the commission, that it was cold, and got appealed up to the Superior Court. The commission won, and the son won before the Superior Court, but then it went up to the appellate court, transferred to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, we think you need some more tools to kind of help figure out the standard for this. So gave us a few factors more that we maybe should look at, kind of borrowing from, I think, some federal case law, and that was something the Superior Court Judge Dan Clow had recommended.
Dan Clow, he's a great judge.
Yes.
He really cares a lot about FOI. Yeah.
He had heard the matter.
So where are you now on that?
So it's back remanded to the commission under this new standard to apply some of these criteria.
So is he asking you to change this, or is he asking you to come back? So he didn't rule. He said, come back to me with the standards you're using to make this call?
The Supreme Court did. Judge Clow ruled that we had rendered our decision appropriately, but he suggested, there's some criterion that could be looked at. And the Supreme Court kind of took that and ran with it and said, yeah, we like those factors. Let's send it back to the commission.
So they haven't ruled yet.
Right.
This is interesting. What's the case called?
It's against, I believe it's the Madison Police Department.
Right. You don't remember what the murder case was?
No,
the woman.
But it's from the lawyer representing the Yale clinic brought the case. And
so what's your role here? So it's fair to say you don't try to tell commissioners what they should do. You lay out the law and where. You actually do write staff reports that say the law clearly says this or not. Like, what are you writing on this?
Right. We advise the commissioners on the state of the law. We'll give them the background, prior cases, and we, the staff, will actually, at the direction of a commissioner, if a commissioner has heard the matter, we will draft the preliminary decision for the commission. So
but the commissioner decides how it should go. The
commission decides. But we have our lawyers serving as hearing officers now, so they'll write these preliminary reports.
So what are you saying here? Are you, by the way, still working on this case, or is your successor?
Yeah, I probably won't be working on it much anymore, but it's with a commissioner and one of our staff attorneys, so they will seek the guidance they need, maybe from the new general counsel.
So pretty soon the FOIC, Freedom of Information Commission, is going to let us know what it means to have a cold case that we should be able to know about without fears of jeopardizing it.
I hope so.
So interesting. And then my other question about whether you can make stuff stick. So there have been a couple of Freedom of Information victories for journalists where they say that cities have to release the written job evaluations, performance evaluations of top officials that the mayor gives, and that school boards, when they evaluate the superintendent, have to release it. So what they've done now is to say, well, we don't want to do that. The law's telling us to do that, but we'll just follow the letter and not the spirit. Now, school boards across the state are not doing written evaluations. They're going in executive session to talk about it. And then when it comes to the job, like in New Haven, what they do is they just don't really do written job descriptions. They just say one check. Here are the criteria. They're doing satisfactory, check, satisfactory. Is there anything the FYC can do about that? Can you say, make a ruling? Should someone bring a case that school board meetings to evaluate the superintendent should now be not allowed to be held in executive session? Can you say, is there a legal basis to say you're violating the spirit of the law in a written evaluation, or you can't really force someone to do a written evaluation, right?
If only we could do that and a lot of other things, that would be terrific. But our role is to deal with existing records and to decide whether they have to be disclosed or not.
Or whether created. So you're saying you just don't create the record. So is there a limit to what your freedom of information can do, like with so much in government, and that it's up to the public to then demand that public officials follow not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law?
Yes.
So speaking of laws, and we're talking to Colleen Murphy, who's finishing a great run, 36 years at the Freedom of Information Commission in Connecticut, which has really been our bulwark of keeping government open and responsive to the public. Do you feel that the FAIC is as strong? Do you feel Freedom of Information law is as strong as it was as when you started? Is it under attack? Is it stronger than it was before? Does it work better or worse? What do you think?
I think that it's very cyclical. Having been there that long, I've definitely seen some highs and lows in terms of how the strength of the law. I have found in the past several years that there seem to be more and more proposals to exempt records.
And this isn't a Democratic Republican thing. A series of Democratic governors have sought to combine agencies that oversee elections and open government. They defund your staff. That's fair to say, right?
Right. I think that's fair to say. I would, anecdotally say that when people aren't the ones in power, they're very, very for open government. And it's just kind of a natural reaction that once you're there, then you suddenly feel a little more, a little more leery of the whole process.
Both Malloy and Lamont really disappointed me. They don't seem to care.
Well, in Malloy was very concerning, the whole consolidation business that you mentioned. And
like the elections enforcement overseers, the freedom of information people trying to make that one agency.
Yes, you all do some sort of government oversight. It seems like you should all go together. We really didn't like that. And also that there was a person that was put in charge, not in charge per se, but appointed by the governor suddenly in our orbit. And it was an experiment that did not work well.
Which really shows that we survived that in Connecticut. That was a real threat to the autonomy of regulators. So how about now with Lamont? He's proposed budget cuts, correct, for your department?
No significant budget cuts really under the Lamont administration, happily. There is some manipulation with the numbers that we put forward to the governor's office, but nothing too serious like we have seen in the past.
What about proposals to make more records exempt?
Yeah, I think there are some exemptions that have been proposed. There have been a few cases that have been decided involving state agencies that have been a little bit perplexing.
Tell me about one of those.
And there's one, but it's really carried forward in several cases by different state agencies concerning fees for electronic records.
That kind of pisses me off. I'm sorry. I mean, like someone presses a computer button, they're charging me as though it were pages of paper that they're printing out.
Right. And more, just the time that was spent for them to press the button. I'm a
little sympathetic of that, not because for police, they have to really dub things out of videos. I feel for them on that.
Right. And for the police, we've been working for many years and with the Police Chiefs Association and others who are interested in transparency and accountability to make sure the body camera footage can be available, but recognizing that it's kind of a unique animal and that maybe there ought to be a little more flexibility in the fee realm for that, but with our involvement, keeping it as low as possible. But what we've seen in these cases that I'm talking about is beyond those kinds of records for all electronic records. And I always say, when I got there in 1991, I think the law passed to say electronic records are public records. And the idea was that it should be easier and cheaper to get access, not the other way around. So
and what happened? And then they started to make it harder by charging you as though it were paper and the time.
Not just as though it were paper, beyond that, just the time spent, searching your computer to find that file. So, I don't know in part if it's because there are some, what some people call difficult requesters who ask for a lot of information. People are like drunk and crazy
off their meds at 1 a.m. and they're saying, I want 9 years worth of records of this. And then everybody has to wait in line when they look for some crazy UFO conspiracy. Right.
It may be a little bit of a response to that, but to see how kind of widespread it is, that there are several agencies that are.
And then we pay for 100 pages that have nothing